Welcome to American History Lesson 11. The War Between the States. Our lesson objectives are: identify and understand important battles and events that took place during the Civil War. Identify key figures who influenced the Union and the Confederacy. Identify the impact the Civil War would have on the reunited country. The Civil War begins. The Confederate States seized federal property in the South. The Civil War began when Southern forces fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor in April of 1861. Lincoln called for volunteers to march against the Confederate States of America. Virginia and 3 other states seceded from the Union and joined the Confederacy. 4 border states that included slaves stayed in the Union. The Union had more people, more industry, more food, more railroads, and a skillful political leader in Abraham Lincoln. The Confederacy had able military leaders and armies motivated by defending their homes from outside influences. Southerners hoped to use the British demand for cotton to their advantage too. Even so, the Confederate government was weak. The Union planned to blockade the southern ports to prevent the sale of cotton and the arrival of supplies. The Union hoped to seize the Mississippi River to split the Confederacy and to capture Richmond. In July, Union and Confederate troops met in the Battle of Bull Run near Washington, D.C. Though the battle would last all day, the Confederate soldiers fought very hard and won a startling victory as the Union troops retreated. Union forces achieved victories in the West, however, and both sides prepared for a long war. Union General Ulysses S. Grant captured 2 river forts and defended Shiloh, Tennessee from the advancing Confederate Army. Union Admiral David Farragut captured New Orleans. Union General George McClellan failed to capture Richmond in the east, though. His opponent, General Robert E. Lee of the Confederacy, led an invasion into Maryland in late 1862. The battle at Antietam was the largest single-day loss of life in American history. Afterwards, when McClellan did not pursue the retreating Confederate army, Lincoln dismissed him. Politics during the Civil War. The South wanted England's support, but Lincoln was determined to prevent that support. Lincoln extended the Union's war effort to call for an end to slavery. On January 1, 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Even though this document did not have the power to free slaves in Confederate eras, it was symbolically important. Many Northerners supported the proclamation because it called for the abolishment of slavery. Free blacks could now enlist in the Union Army. Northern Democrats thought the Emancipation Proclamation would lengthen the war because it made Southerners angry and more determined to preserve their way of life. Because the English did not want to be perceived as pro-slavery, they decided not to support the Confederacy. Lincoln and Davis both suspended the rights of habeas corpus, so now police could arrest and hold dissidents without a trial. Both Union and Confederacy began to draft people into their armies. Northern workers who opposed the draft protested by rioting. The worst riots occurred in New York and lasted as long as 4 days. Because they were blamed for the war, many African Americans were attacked and some were killed in the riots. African Americans joined the Union Army. Near the end of the war, approximately 10% of the Northern Army was African American. African American soldiers suffered discrimination, but in 1864, Congress increased their pay to equal the pay of white soldiers. The war's impact on the home front. Southern slaves began to disobey their white owners. Some refused to work at all, and some destroyed property. Still others ran away. By 1864, the plantation system and slavery were ending. The Confederacy experienced drastic food shortages and prices for available goods increased greatly. There are reports that some Southerners sold cotton to the North to have cash to purchase food. In the North, the war created an economic boom and increase in manufacturing and industrial production. Western farmers produced more food. Women joined the workforce in increasing numbers. Business owners began to realize large profits, sometimes overcharging customers or cheating the government. Life for soldiers in both armies was hard. Camps were dirty and unhealthy, causing many deaths due to disease. Food was unappealing and the rations were meager for Southern soldiers. Life for prisoners was even worse because they did not have adequate shelter or food because the fighting soldiers had priority over prisoners. A group of Northern women and doctors created the Sanitary Commission to help care for soldiers. Commission members taught soldiers how to make camps less prone to disease and how to improve living conditions as much as possible. The Sanitary Commission recruited nurses to care for the sick and injured. Women also worked as nurses in the South. The end of the Civil War. After 2 additional victories, Confederate General Robert E. Lee invaded the Union once again. This invasion was stopped in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Both Confederate and Union armies suffered heavy losses in the Battle of Gettysburg. Union General Grant captured Vicksburg, Mississippi, and the Mississippi River then fell to the Union. In the fall of 1863, the Union government held a ceremony to dedicate a cemetery at Gettysburg. Lincoln delivered a short speech that helped people start to think that the United States was not a collection of states, but was now a single nation. This is known as the Gettysburg Address. Lincoln then named Grant as commander of all Northern armies. Grant's plan was to fight Lee's army, while General William Tecumseh Sherman, who was the commander of the Union's armies in the West, invaded Georgia. The battles between Grant and Lee were fierce, and the North lost many soldiers. After Sherman captured Atlanta, his army began to march across the state to the seacoast, living off the land and destroying property across the South. Lincoln faced difficulties in the 1864 election. Democrats nominated former General McClellan as a candidate who was dedicated to peace within the nation. Republican Party radicals felt that Lincoln was not being harsh on the South. Sherman's victory in Atlanta helped Lincoln win his re-election. In the spring of 1865, the South collapsed. Lee, along with other Confederate commanders, surrendered his army. The Civil War was over. The Civil War's impact upon America. The Civil War changed politics in several important ways. No longer could states secede from the Union. Federal power over the states increased. Economic changes, including pro-business policies and the establishment of the national banking system. The Northern economy boomed, but the Southern economy was in shambles. Industry was destroyed, nearly half the livestock died, and farmland was ruined. The South would struggle under the depressed economy for many years. In terms of the human cost of the war, more than 600,000 soldiers died and more than 500,000 were wounded. The Civil War changed the way future wars were fought. Shooting was more accurate with rifle guns, and trench warfare was adopted by soldiers. New weapons such as landmines, grenades, and ironclad warships were developed. In 1865, one of the biggest changes came for African Americans when the approval of the 13th Amendment ended slavery. Shortly after Lee's surrender, John Wilkes Booth, an actor who sympathized with the South, shot and killed Abraham Lincoln. Fun fact, more than 3 million men fought in the Civil War, about 900,000 for the Confederacy and 2.1 million for the Union. An estimated 300 women disguised themselves as men and fought in the ranks. There were over 2,000 boys who were under 14 years or younger in the Union ranks. 300 were 13 years or less, while there were 200,000 no older than 16 years. More than 620,000 people, or 2% of the population, died in the Civil War. What next? Take the time to go back and review the lesson on your own. After your review, complete the lesson review for the lesson and submit for grading. Remember, your submission should follow all the rules for standard written English. All submissions must be written in your own words and sources used cited at the end. How to cite sources in APA format. When you reference a source within an APA-style paper, whether it is using a direct quote, repurposing an image, or simply referring to an idea or theory, you should insert an in-text citation, the author's surname, and the date of publication within parentheses, straight after a direct quote. CitationMachine.net will assist you in creating citations.